This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 82 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about how teachers can make school a safe place for LGBTQ students. Depending on where you live, you might think we've reached a point where society has truly embraced people of all gender and sexual identities, making the topic of LGBTQ rights kind of a non-issue. The truth is, for many LGBTQ students, discrimination and harassment are still a daily reality, and school is one of the main places where they experience these things. A 2015 National School Climate Study conducted by GLSEN, an organization focused on ensuring safe and affirming schools for LGBTQ students, found that over 85% of these students have experienced verbal harassment and 66% have been discriminated against based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. As a result of feeling more isolated and unsafe, many of these students miss school, avoid bathrooms, and stay away from locker rooms. Students who experience more victimization are also more likely to have lower GPAs and to report feeling depressed. And it's not just other students who create this hostile climate for their LGBTQ peers. Over half of the more than 10,000 students surveyed reported hearing biased remarks from school staff, and school staff often fail to intervene when they hear these remarks at school. The good news is that overall, the number of students who report being harassed or discriminated against is declining. The climate is improving across the board, but for many students, it's not happening fast enough. As educators, we set the tone for how our students treat each other. No, we can't control everything, but we can do a lot to influence the climate in our schools and make sure our classrooms are places where all students feel welcome. The best place to learn more about the specific things you can do is on GLSEN's website, which is glsen.org. And on my website, I've posted two of their best resources for teachers, and those are the Safe Space Kit and then a kit called Ready, Set, Respect, which is for elementary teachers specifically. And if you go to Cult of Pedagogy, click on podcast, and then click on episode 82, which is what we're in right now, you can find links to all of this stuff. Both of these resources are really loaded with specific actionable things that you can do. But to get you started, I've pulled some of the most important steps teachers can take. I also interviewed Becca Mui, who is GLSEN's education manager, to contribute her insights to this podcast. These tips will give you a good start toward making your school safer and more welcoming for LGBTQ students. Before we get into the tips, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, writeabout.com, a platform that helps your students fall in love with writing. Writeabout.com is a writing community and publishing platform for classrooms and schools, a space for daily writing across all genres and purposes. We know that choice and audience motivate student writers, and Writeabout has the custom environment you need to safely leverage that engagement in your ELA or content area lessons. If your school has a goal to increase how much students are writing, the Writeabout school platform is simple and affordable. Make writing across your community more visible and collaborative this year. Visit writeabout.com to start for free. Okay, so tip number 1 for supporting your LGBTQ students is to educate yourself. If you do not personally identify as LGBTQ or spend time in that community, you'll be a much more effective ally if you commit to listening and learning about the issues. Here's Becca Mui from GLSEN.
A huge portion of support is staying educated. So things like listening to the podcast or just reading some blogs about LGBTQ people and continually learning about that can help you become an ally and an advocate in your school.
Making an effort to use whatever terminology is currently embraced by the LGBTQ community is another important way to show respect. Here's some more of my conversation with Becca Mui about the terminology that's currently being used within the LGBTQ community.
It's always helpful to have kind of a common language and a shared language when you're talking about identities. And I think one of the things that is tricky about like LGBTQ identities and in trans identities when people are not part of those communities and not educating themselves about them like really actively, it can be difficult because that language is changing, specifically around the language we're using to talk about gender. And that's something that you really have to be kind of clued into, and work to stay on top of it. And sometimes, I tell educators that I'm working with, it is literally my job to be connected, to be supported, to know what's going on. And I'm constantly finding out that something's been updated, something's been changed. And, I think that kind of having the attitude and understanding that that's okay, that we use the language we have and we are open to learning that something's been updated from people, and really quickly just understanding that that's like a process that might happen, can be really useful.
I think I see an attitude, particularly, I think, in people who stay out of these spaces of like, okay, what word are we supposed to use this year? And it's a real cynical, negative kind of an attitude. And I feel like it's just really that openness that you just mentioned is so important, because it's just really a matter of being respectful to people and how would they like to be referred to. So anyway, so yeah, let's get into the acronym.
Great. So, at GLSEN, we tend to use LGBTQ. So that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. There are different variations. Some other popular ones are LGBTQ plus, to just be inclusive of other identities after that, and LGBTQIA, which includes intersex and asexual people. It depends on which
Okay.
version of LGBTQ kind of depends on the population that you're serving. So
Okay.
lesbian, is a person who's female identified, who's emotionally or physically attracted to other females. Um, Gay, similar, but male identified person who's emotionally or physically attracted to some other males. And I think something to note, there's some populations that will use gay to refer to the whole LGBTQ community. And that's something that we're trying to move away from, because it also kind of centers the same idea of allowing like cis men to kind of be the umbrella for other groups of people, and we don't want to model that like in the
Got
LGBTQ
it.
community. So we do try to stay away from saying like the gay community or gay rights, for example, instead of LGBTQ rights. So a bi person, a person who's emotionally or physically attracted to two genders, and there's a lot of bi visibility and bi movement that's happening right now, and that I'm learning about right now. And so one of the ideas of the two can sometimes also mean being attracted to genders like yours and also genders that are not like yours. T stands for trans, or transgender, and so that's an umbrella term for people whose gender identity doesn't match the sex that they were assigned at birth. And then Q, last one is queer, and that's also an umbrella term. It really can be used to describe sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression that isn't kind of conforming to like heteronormativity or the dominant societal norm.
Got it. Okay, because let's talk a little bit about the term queer, because I'm thinking if somebody's sort of new to this terminology, they're going to say, well, isn't that a derogatory term? So why would this community embrace that term?
Absolutely. Historically, it was used as a slur, and in a derogatory sense. And, you'll see this kind of intergenerationally within the LGBTQ community to have different opinions about its use and its where and when it's used. But now I think, in our work specifically around supporting LGBTQ youth, our focus is always with them and the identities and the terms that they're using to feel good about themselves. And I personally also identify as queer. I think that there is a power in reclaimed words, and we find that in marginalized identities across different types of identities, but in the power to take a word that has been used negatively and really say, this is mine, I identify this way. There's some power in that I know that I feel, and that a lot of specifically young LGBTQ young people are feeling. And I think also something that's preferencing that term is also that it's inclusive in a way that really brings trans visibility, but also just some flexibility within like non-heterosexual identities. To say that I can be, I can be queer and you can be queer, and we don't have to necessarily think about you don't have to identify as a female or as a male.
I was going to ask it. I wanted to sort of check my understanding, because my impression of why a person would prefer the term queer over something more narrow like lesbian would be to sort of acknowledge the fluidity of sexuality, and also the idea that this is sort of anything other than heteronormative. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think,
Okay.
it's interesting. It goes back and forth. There is, some people that are saying that are lesbian identified that, don't feel narrow and don't feel, limited by that, and are really trying to reclaim like the femininity or the identity, the history. Sorry, not femininity, but the history within that identity. And so I think there's really valid, they're all really valid identities, and it's really just giving people the space to find the ones that work for them and to identify the way that feels right to them.
Got it. So two other things. The term cisgender, this has been a new one for me in this past year. I've seen it way more often this year than I have anywhere else.
Yes.
And I actually just got done Googling it because I was like, I know what it means, but I don't know why that is the term. So apparently it comes from like Latin and German. But so when somebody says that they are cis or non-cis, what do they actually mean by that?
So a cisgender person is someone whose gender identity is aligned with the gender that they were assigned at birth, or the sex that they were assigned at birth. So I identify as cisgender because I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as a woman.
Got it. So this is usually used to differentiate between someone who is transgender. This would sort of be the opposite of transgender, would be
Yes.
cisgender.
And it's used to bring visibility. I think when we're talking about marginalized identities, or people that hold marginalized identities, we also want to be careful to be naming the norm, quote unquote, and so that we're not just further othering people and saying, oh, there's trans people and then there's people.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, there's cisgender people and there's transgender people as well, as some of the many options.
I noticed on Glissan's site, and this is, I think, my last question when it comes to terminology, and you said this when you introduced yourself too, that it looks to me that everyone on your staff, underneath their profile, it lists their pronouns, I believe. And when you introduced yourself, and now I'm blanking on how you actually phrased it.
Absolutely. Pronoun visibility and front loading with pronouns is one of the really inclusive measures that we're trying to model, and that also, I think educators should really be aware of. It's really thinking about and sharing something that you don't want people to assume. So I get to, choose my gender expression. I get to choose how I look, how my hair is, how I'm dressing, how I'm holding my hands. And those are all things that I don't want someone to use to assume that I am, to assume my gender identity. I don't want them to assume that I am female, or to assume that I use she and her pronouns if I don't. And so just kind of moving away from this idea that we can look at someone, guess based on what we're seeing how they identify or what pronouns we should use for them, and then applying them to them.
And a lot of that, again, I'm checking my own understanding, a lot of that has come from what I believe has been a more recent development with some of the trans folk wanting to be referred to with a plural pronoun, correct?
A gender neutral pronoun, for sure. So like they, them, but in the singular sense.
Okay. So you're saying they, but you're still, okay, I got you. So it's known as a plural word, but it's meant to be singular.
And actually, yes, it's actually they as a singular pronoun has been added to Merriam-Webster dictionary and has been added to APA formatting. So it's something that is definitely kind of being recognized more in quote unquote like standard English places, and we're working kind of like colloquially to get it as well.
Another term that comes up frequently in discussions of LGBTQ issues is heteronormativity, or we've also used the word heteronormative. which is defined by the Queer Dictionary as the belief or assumption that all people are heterosexual, or that heterosexuality is the default or normal state of a human being. In our schools and in our society at large, we often come from a heteronormative place, speaking of the LGBTQ population as the other. And this communicates to our LGBTQ students that they are deviant or unnatural in some way. We're going to talk a little bit more about heteronormativity in just a little while. The Safe Space Kit that I mentioned earlier includes a lot more information about some of the prominent issues in the community and some other terminology. Number 2 is to check your biases. As with any kind of advocacy, it is crucial to understand your own background and biases on these issues. I'll read a quote to you from the Safe Space Kit. All of us, LGBT, and this is an older publication, so they didn't have the Q yet. All of us, LGBT and non-LGBT, have learned messages about LGBT people. What were the earliest messages you received about LGBT people, and where did they come from? Were they positive, negative, or neutral? Understanding the messages we receive can help us identify our own beliefs and biases that we can then challenge, helping make us stronger allies. In the Safe Space Kit, there is an actual exercise called Check Yourself that actually kind of goes through your own history a little bit more, and it's a much more thorough way to look at your underlying beliefs. So I'm going to keep mentioning that Safe Space Kit, as I go, because it's so comprehensive and it's free, and they do a much better job. I'm trying to just touch on the major points, but that would be the place to really dive in. And one of the main reasons I'm even doing this podcast is to urge you to go and download their materials because they're just really excellent. Okay, so the first 2 steps are to educate yourself and to really look carefully at your biases. I don't know if I'm saying biases right or not. It's biases or biases. Okay, and then step number 3, and these are not sequential. You sort of are going to circle around between all of these things sort of throughout your life, really. Once you've sort of decided to be supportive, these are all different things you can do. So number 3 is teach inclusively. The things we teach and how we teach them can send important messages to our students about whether or not they're valued as they are.
So much of our language is gendered in ways that we're not really thoughtful of, just saying, oh, boys and girls, and not really thinking about, who we're saying that to or addressing, the compliments that we're giving to students, really thinking about how are we using language, how are we making space in our language for students to identify and be whoever and however they want is a really important step.
Here are some things you can do to make sure you're nurturing your LGBTQ students in your instruction. One of these is to include a variety of gender representations. When students are presented with a narrow picture of gender roles and they don't see themselves in any of them, they develop a sense early on that something is wrong with them. GLSEN's Ready, Set, Respect toolkit for elementary teachers encourages you to make sure that classroom books and materials include diverse families and people whose careers and other life roles don't conform to gender stereotypes. Another way to teach inclusively is to group students neutrally. Out of habit, teachers will often divide students into boy and girl groups. This can make students who don't conform to gender-based stereotypes feel uncomfortable and isolated. The Ready, Set, Respect toolkit recommends that instead we divide students more neutrally by birthday month or by numbering them as 1s and 2s. Another way to teach inclusively is to evaluate your speech and materials for heteronormative and gender normative bias. In casual conversation, in the examples we use while teaching, and in our materials, we often communicate assumptions about gender and sexuality. For example, boys are attracted to and will grow up to marry girls, and vice versa. Girls will naturally prefer activities like shopping, while boys will naturally be interested in athletics, and so on. All of these send the message that there is only one way to be normal, and that students who don't fit these descriptions are abnormal. As you talk and teach and look at your materials, ask yourself whether you're communicating these messages, and then find ways to replace them with more inclusive examples. And then the last way to teach more inclusively, and this is still just number 3, this is just about sort of the things that you're doing while you're actively teaching, is to include positive representations of LGBTQ people in your curriculum.
As an educator, thinking about what it is that you're teaching, whatever curriculum that is, there are people usually involved in that, whether that's the people you're listing in a math problem, or the histories that you're teaching in a history class, or in the ways that you're talking about, even in math and in science, there are ways to bring about diversity in terms of LGBTQ and gender diversity you can that you can do, and we have supports around that. But really thinking about integrating that into your learning, it helps all of your students really to learn more about the world, and it helps LGBTQ students kind of see themselves in their learning.
GLSEN has resources on LGBTQ history that can help with this. As with all resources, teachers should preview them before offering them to students. GLSEN serves K-12 students, and you will know best which activities and lessons will meet your students' needs. I'm going to take a quick break to thank this episode's other sponsor, PeerGrade. PeerGrade is a platform that makes it easy to facilitate peer review in your classroom. Students review each other's work while PeerGrade takes care of anonymously assigning reviewers and delivering all the relevant insights to teachers. With PeerGrade, students learn to think critically and take ownership of their learning. They also learn to write kind and useful feedback for their peers. PeerGrade is free to use for teachers and students. To learn more, visit cultofpedagogy.com/peergrade, PeerGrade. Okay, the fourth way that you can make your classroom more welcoming for LGBTQ students is to be visible. Let your LGBTQ students know that you are an ally by displaying some visible sign of your support. Hanging a rainbow flag or a safe space poster or sticker, which is available from the GLSEN website, and I've put a link on Cult of Pedagogy where you can grab that. Hanging any of these things in your classroom can accomplish this. GLSEN's Safe Space Kit points out that this kind of visibility affects students more than we might even realize. Even if students don't come to you directly, the kit says, research shows that just knowing there is a supportive educator at school can help LGBT students feel better about being in school. Number 5 is respond to anti-LGBTQ behavior. When students experience harassment in your presence, take action. Simply saying something like, "that language is unacceptable," is enough to acknowledge the act and stop it. The Safe Space Kit includes a lot more detailed information on turning incidents like these into teachable moments and how to respond in more specific situations, like when a student says, "that's so gay." But the most important thing to remember is to not ignore it. The Safe Space Kit says, remember, no action is an action. If an incident is overlooked or not addressed, it can imply acceptance and approval. Number 6 is support students who come out. As you make yourself more visible as an ally, students may be more likely to come out to you about their sexual orientation or gender identity. This important and sensitive conversation needs to be handled carefully, and the Safe Space Kit offers detailed advice for teachers. Their most important advice is to listen. Instead of assuming that you know what the student needs or that their situation will be similar to that of other LGBTQ students or people that you have known, treat each student as an individual and just let them talk. Ask them what they need and how you can help. And you can even give them GLSEN's new Coming Out resource, which I've provided a link to on my website, to students. It's a nice document that you can give to them that sort of gives them advice on how to approach this step in their lives. And it might also be useful to let students know about hotlines they can call to get out-of-school support. I've put a link to the LGBT National Help Center. If you're just listening, it's glbthotline.org. All one word, glbthotline.org. They've got a collection of hotline numbers that you can give to students. Keep in mind that this student is trusting you with confidential information that you should not share until they're ready. To be on the safe side, talk to your administrator now and guidance counselor ahead of time about what your school policy says about confidentiality. If your school policy doesn't go far enough to protect the rights of students, then work to change that. Policies regarding confidentiality should also take gender identity into account. GLSEN provides guidelines for these considerations in its transgender model district policy. And here's a quote from it. It is critical that parental guardian approval is never a prerequisite for respecting a student's chosen name, appropriate gender, and pronouns. Staff should take guidance from and work collaboratively with the student to ensure that the student remains safe, both at school and at home. So this can be a pretty sticky issue for some teachers depending on the community that you work in. So I would advise you to get with your administrator if you have a supportive administrator or any other supportive staff members and take a look at your school policy and sort of try proactively to work that policy until it's supportive of student rights and privacy. Okay, step number 7 or action number 7 would be to support a student GSA. GSA, I thought it stood for Gay Straight Alliance, and it may be that it used to, but now GLSEN is supporting it being called Gender Sexuality Alliance. So their research, and this would be a student club, GLSEN's research has shown that the existence of a student GSA can go a long way toward improving a school's climate for LGBTQ students.
Those need to be started by students, but kind of asking students if that's something that they want support around. Usually you do need an adult advisor.
So offering your services in that way can make a GSA a reality in your school. Number 8 is to revisit your school policies. And we covered this a little bit when we talked about student privacy, but there's more. Making sure that your school's anti-bullying and anti-discrimination policies include language specific to sexual orientation and gender identity can also improve your school's climate. And GLSEN's research has found these types of policies to have significant impact on quality of life for LGBTQ students. Part of your work as an advocate is looking into these policies and working toward real change. And I've got a link on the site to GLSEN's model policies. They've got sort of templates and boilerplate language and just a lot of good examples that you can use. So if you want to just go there from listening here, it's glisten.org/model policies, all one word. And so the very last suggestion or the last tip for supporting your LGBTQ students is to educate your colleagues. Apart from being more vocal and open with your own support for LGBTQ students, you can also conduct your own workshops for colleagues. The Safe Space Kit includes a sample 20-minute presentation teachers can give school staff. GLSEN also offers in-person professional development.
We are a national organization, like I mentioned, but we also have 40 local chapters, which are amazingly volunteer-run by humans who are just really dedicated and fantastic in this work. And they're doing this work on the ground. And so we support them here from the national office with resources, and they really can implement professional development in schools. So if there is a GLSEN chapter near you, you can request professional development.
On the site, there's a link to a map of local GLSEN chapters. So we've gone over 9 different things you can do to send a message of love and acceptance to your LGBTQ students, those you know about, and especially those you don't. Committing yourself to taking even a few of these steps can make such an incredible difference, impacting students' mental health, their safety, their academic success, and their overall quality of life. It just takes one person to start tipping the scales, to start moving a school culture in a more inclusive direction. I very much hope, for the sake of the students who need you, that you'll be that person. For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, go to podcasts, and click on episode 82. To get weekly updates on all my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. And if you're enjoying this podcast, I'd love it if you'd leave me a review on iTunes. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day. This podcast is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. To learn more, visit edupodcastnetwork.com.